Sorry, I'm like so nervous. I was like, make it false reading.
No, I know, I'm very nervous also. It's good. I'm glad it's everyone's first time. So, yeah.
There we are. Hello, everybody. Hi, I'm Allison, the events manager for Barbara's Bookstore, and I am so excited to welcome you all to Telling Queer Tales, a book event with Betsy Cornwell. So we're here. This is our first in a series of virtual events that we will be offering throughout the months upcoming, focusing on in-depth interviews with authors on specific topics, and I am so incredibly excited to be here and to be hosting this event with you guys. Before we get started, there's a little bit of business, and I want to tell you a bit about Crowdcast in case you've never been here before. Firstly, this is one of our first events with Crowdcast, so I hope that you guys can all be patient with us as we deal with any technical issues that might come up. If things end up going sideways, please bear with us and stick around. We are going to get ourselves back up and running as quickly as we can. Hopefully, knock on wood, that won't be a thing. Also, feel free to please chat in the chat on the side with your fellow book lovers. We'll also be providing links with more information and where to purchase books and things like that, like upcoming events. So make sure to keep an eye on the chat. If you notice that your video is freezing or you're experiencing a lag, make sure to click on the little gear button that should be somewhere down there and switch your HD setting to 360. That will use up less bandwidth and it might speed it up and help with any lag issues you might have. So the last 10 to 15 minutes of the event is going to be open for questions. So if you happen to have one, please put it in the Ask a Question portion button that's kind of down there. And then if you don't necessarily want to ask a question, but you see a question that you like, make sure to upvote it because that will move it up on the thingy so that we'll be able to see it. Also, if you look just below the video, you're going to see a click here to purchase a copy of The Circus Rose. So that little green button will take you directly to our website where you'll be able to purchase Betsy's book as well as any other books that you might be interested in. We will be carrying The Circus Rose at all of our locations when it comes out on June 16th. So please make sure to call your locations and make sure that they do have it in stock, as things have been crazy with everything going on and sometimes shipments can get delayed. And lastly, make sure that you're being as respectful and kind to your fellow book lovers as you can. This is designed to be an informative, fun event, and we want to make sure to keep it that way. So please be as kind and respectful as you can in the chats and elsewhere. All right, I think that's everything. I think we're ready to start. So I'd like to present to everyone, coming to the screen is Betsy Cornwell.
I'm here, I think. Hello?
We hear you. For sure, okay. We hear you. Not quite
That's
see
good.
you, Jeff, but
all right.
We do.
Hopefully, I'm getting here.
Oh, there he is.
Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. I am so pleased to be talking with you all the way from the west of Ireland. I feel really lucky to get to participate in American book launch events like this from all the way over here. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I know it's a bit on the later side for you, so thank you for making the time and slowing down your bedtime a little bit for us.
No, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
So let's start a little bit with your origin story. So can you tell me a little bit about how you began writing?
Sure. Well, I wanted to be a writer ever since I learned how to read, pretty much. I remember being 6 years old and looking at books on my first grade bookshelf and thinking that I really wanted to have my name on one of those books someday. So it really is a dream that I've had my whole life, and I'm so happy that I get to write books for a living now, like I always wanted to do. The biggest sort of roadblock for me was always kind of perfectionism. Like, I really wanted to be a good writer my whole life, but a lot of the things that I would start writing, I really didn't like them. And so I would give up on a story after, a few pages. And then when I was in college, I found a program called National Novel Writing Month, which is pretty well known by now, I think. And basically, it's awesome. It's a challenge that asks people to write a whole novel in 30 days every November. And what really was helpful for me about that was it forced me to look at writing every day as a sort of practice rather than all about quality. It was kind of about quantity. So you had to write about 7 pages a day in order to finish your book by the end of the month. And by that time, I was sort of so sick of my own nonsense about, about my self-loathing about my writing and stuff. And I just wanted to prove to myself that I could write a book, even if it was the worst book the world had ever seen. I just wanted to know that I could do it. And it turned out that's exactly what I needed to do. And I wrote my manuscript, and it was pretty bad. But then after that month, I revised it and I kept working on it for a couple years. And it eventually, 5 years later, was published as my first novel. And still now I find the first draft the hardest part of writing, because it's so easy to judge yourself. I like editing a lot more, which I know not every writer is like that. But I teach creative writing at the university here in Galway now, and that is the biggest thing I try to get across to my students is, if you really want to do long form writing, whether that's a memoir or a novel or a short story collection, what have you, you have to be able to think of it as a daily practice instead of as always doing good writing, because no one always does good writing and you'd never get anything done that way. So, I still, The Circus Rose is my 5th book, and the first draft is really about sort of letting go of self-judgment and letting it become whatever it wants to become, and then fixing it later. I think that's the biggest part of my origin story as a writer. So.
That is definitely, I think, the biggest hurdle for so many people, like in most things. It's just that feeling of like, this whole thing sucks. Like none of this is working.
Yes, exactly. Well, I've actually, during quarantine, I've started running, which like even 6 months ago, Betsy would be horrified to hear that I was like running. It seems so bizarre, but it's this, that has been the same to me. It's just getting out and doing it. No matter how slowly I go, it turns it into something fun instead of thinking, oh, I'm bad at this, that will kill the joy of anything. So yeah,
for sure. So all of your books always have kind of an inspiration coming from like fairy tales and folklore. So what was kind of like the impetus for your love of fairy tales and like incorporating that so much into your writing?
Well, I always loved fantasy and fairy tales. I liked to imagine there were fairies in my backyard growing up and that kind of thing. I remember my grandparents had some really beautifully illustrated books of fairy tales at their house that I loved to dig through and pore over. And then some of my early favorite books were like Ella Enchanted and Beauty by Robin McKinley, which are great fairy tale retellings. And then when I was in college, I took a class called Fairytales and Gender, which, clearly has influenced my work ever since. We read books like The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, which is an amazing collection of really dark feminist fairy tale retellings for adults. Kissing the Witch by Emmett Donahue, which is a collection of queer fairy tale retellings. Transformations by Anne Sexton, which is a great book of poems that are fairy tale retellings. And I've kind of been fascinated by this concept of looking at familiar tales from different perspectives ever since. So I think, that was part of it. And then also part of my sort of insecurities about writing early on were I felt like I wasn't good at creating plot lines, that I could do descriptions and characters and that kind of thing. So I started to think, a fairy tale or a classic story is a plot line that's been proven to work already. So if I could kind of take that plot and like drape my pretty writing over it, then that might help me out a little bit. And it works. I still have my students. They can be sort of plot training wheels, a story that is already proven to be interesting. It can teach you how to write a plot, so that's definitely something. Their structure interests me as well as their content.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
So I feel like many of your books have this kind of consistent theme about freedom, and that can be freedom from religion, from gender, from societal norms. And many fairy tales can be kind of viewed almost like morality tales, where it is more about upholding those norms. So I'm curious about what the importance of kind of revisiting those stories and kind of being able to, like, what do those stories offer us? Essentially.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think one of the things that first got me interested in rewriting fairy tales was that exact idea. And I ended up writing a thesis when I was in college that was a collection of retellings. And the one I was working on most at that point was what ended up becoming my second novel, Mechanica, which is a retelling of Cinderella, because I started thinking about stories, about fairy tales as kind of machines, and that they were all sort of perfectly constructed to kind of funnel their heroines into this one particular ending where you marry a prince and live happily ever after. And they were so perfectly constructed to do that. but in a way that was kind of stifling. And, as a young woman in college who had a long-term boyfriend at the time, I kind of felt like there was a lot of pressure in my life to funnel towards this one narrow definition of what a happy ending was. And so I started thinking about maybe a heroine who could reach inside her own story and take it apart and build it into something else that worked for her more specifically. And I read something Kurt Vonnegut said about that he thought Cinderella was the perfect story structure. And you can look up, he did a lovely drawing of sort of a graph of the plot of Cinderella that's really interesting. And he said, it's basically the most perfect story structure he'd ever come across. And I thought, here's a story that really is this perfect machine that's dragging Cinderella through to her happy ending. And steampunk was sort of a big visual trend when I was in college in the late aughts. And so I thought, wouldn't it be cool to do a kind of steampunk take on Cinderella where the heroine is an inventor and then she can not only literally take machines apart and rebuild them, but also kind of reach inside the Cinderella story and rebuild it into something a little bit different that maybe suits her better than what every other Cinderella gets as a happy ending. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that idea of kind of allowing your characters to kind of deconstruct the story themselves. I think that's a really interesting point. I think a lot of times, especially for people who love writing, there kind of comes those moments where you're writing and you think like, this is not where you're supposed to go, man. Like you were supposed to go, I had a plan for you. You were supposed to go this way. Now you're going this way. And we are not agreeing.
Yeah, that's one of those things that like I find hard to explain to people who aren't readers or writers. I think sometimes my characters do things I don't want them to do because, right, like I made them up. They should do what I want them to do, but that's not always the case. And I think that's often, I tell my students, that's kind of a moment when your book is sort of taking on a life of its own and becoming something fresh and interesting, is when it doesn't necessarily follow the exact path that you planned out for it. And I think one of the reasons that I find drafting so difficult, but that, I think it's so important to just do it, is to trust that process and allow yourself to keep following a thread that you might not know where it's going. I think, I got this from someone else and I can't remember who, which is terrible. But if you think of your first draft as kind of driving along a road at night and you can only see as far ahead as the headlights. But then by the time you get to the end of the draft, morning has come and you can look back and see the whole road that you've been following. And that's a really great feeling when you finish a draft and you can, it might be a mess, but you can see all the things starting to come together. That's a really good feeling. And you never get there if you don't kind of trust the process as you're drafting. So. Exactly.
So your book Tides talks about selkies, and the Circus Rose talks about like Snow White and Rose Red. Now, both of those things are slightly, at least for American audiences, are like a little bit more on the obscure side. Is there something that kind of fascinates you about trying to go for kind of lesser known fairy tales versus going for like folk tales and fairy tales that are more commonly known, such as like Cinderella or The Forest Queen, which is a take on Robin Hood?
Definitely. I think with all my books so far, I've just kind of looked at tales that have always been compelling to me. There are certain, I think everyone's like this, there are certain stories that kind of stick in your mind over the years and might sort of almost bother you in a way, like there's something that you can't stop thinking about them. Selkies, I mean, I happened to hear about them at a Girl Scouts International Culture Conference when I was 8 years old, and I was fascinated by them ever since then. So that was just a weird thing. But it seemed like even then, I remember just thinking about, this Selkie who'd been captured by her husband and then, later returned to the sea and left her children behind. And even at 8 years old, I was thinking about, the relationships that parents have with their children and what it means for a woman to be held captive by her husband and things like that. I think I wasn't able to articulate that until a lot later. But so I think it was less about it being an obscure story and one that just kind of clicked with me in some way. But I do feel like there is a little more freedom with stories that haven't, say, been made into a bunch of Disney films or something, because people have preconceived ideas about them. So, I think like when I was writing Cinderella, I was very aware of the specific film images that people would have in their heads. Whereas with Snow White and Rose Red, it's a very loose retelling, The Circus Rose, that just kind of takes images from the tale than all the plot points per se. And I think I felt I had more freedom to do that because it's not as famous a tale as, say, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which is a totally different Snow White character, not the same Snow White as this one. So yeah.
That actually led me directly into my next question. So, because I know that I imagine there was probably a little bit of confusion because a lot of the information that we get about this book is that it's a queer retelling of Snow White and Rose Red. And so I'm curious about, did you receive any kind of like confusion or deal with any of that when talking to people and like pitching the story and stuff like that about the fact that like this isn't Snow White?
Yeah, I have been talking to people about the book. I think I had been talking about it with my editor by the time I wrote the proposal, and so I think she knew what I was talking about. But yeah, I think I hadn't. I ended up putting in a quote from the translation of the Brothers Grimm tale that's in Andrew Lang's Blue Fairy book, which was a Victorian fairy tale collection that he put out that was very popular at the time and has like led to a lot of the retellings that we know today in the media. So I put the quote that said from Snow White and Rose Red, but I think, right, it is strange. They're both Brothers Grimm stories about a little girl named Snow White. And I think they have similar themes in some ways about like the three big fairy tale colors I always think are white, red, and black. And both of them are full of those three colors. And that's something that I find really interesting and tried to kind of hopefully subvert a little bit, like that white is always associated with purity and red with passion and black with, evil. And like, I hopefully tried to mess with that a little bit in this book. But so I think thematically they're similar, but the character is not the same at all. And people do get a little confused about that.
A little bit, for sure. Yeah. So what drew you specifically to this story?
Yeah, a couple things. It's another one that has just always fascinated me ever, I first came across it in childhood. I think one simple thing is just I've always loved really big, gentle animals. Like when I watched Sesame Street as a toddler, my favorite was Snuffleupagus. And like I loved My Neighbor Totoro and like elephants and whales, and anything really big but really gentle just pulls at my heartstrings right away. And so I loved the idea of this big, giant, fearsome looking bear that would just take care of these two little girls all the time. I thought that was so sweet. And so I spent a lot of time working on my descriptions of bear and how huge bear is and yet how gentle. And then I think also that it's a story about sisters, about two girls who are really similar in some ways, but really different in others. That's really interesting to me. And so, I wanted there to have two narrative voices that were really different, but kind of harmonized with each other, hopefully. So.
For sure. Speaking of those two voices, when you were writing this book, you wrote half of the book in verse and half of the book in prose, which was so fascinating to read, kind of giving you a chance to kind of not only get into the minds of these two characters, but also be able to hear just how distinct their voices are. Can you tell me a little bit?
Oh, I think your voice has gone silent for me, but hopefully you guys can still hear me.
Oh yeah, we can hear you. Okay. Can you see me? Okay. Am I here?
Yeah, now you're back. Okay. Yeah. So, sorry. Can you just repeat the question again?
Yes, of course. This is what we're talking about. Technical difficulties. Bear with us, everybody. So I was wondering about kind of the process of writing, this book, and specifically choosing to write it with 50% of the book being prose and kind of 50% being in verse by splitting up that narration.
Okay, great. Well, I always wanted their voices to be really different. And part of it is that one of the twins, Rosie, has I mean, this is a sort of fantasy world set in a Victorian type era, so they wouldn't be using the same medical terminology, but I think of Rosie as having a kind of sensory processing disorder, or being on the autism spectrum somehow. And so I wanted to convey her seeing the world in like a non-prosaic way a little bit. And I messed with some different ways to do that. But while, I was writing the book at a kind of challenging time in my own life when my marriage had just broken down and I was trying to figure out how to be a single parent and work multiple jobs and still meet my book deadlines and all this. And so many times I sat down at the computer and I was really struggling to sort of think through these sort of logical way in which the other narrator thinks. So she's an engineer, and she sort of thinks in a prosaic, logical way. And so I started breaking the lines for Rosie's sections because that was more how I was thinking at the time. And it kind of felt like what her voice was like to me as someone who maybe needed a little more space and needed a little bit of a different way to process her thoughts. And so that came through as verse, and that just felt really good. I definitely don't, I get a lot of imposter syndrome thinking of myself as a poet. I went to an M.F.A program with a very avant-garde poetry division, and I don't think of myself as doing all the very intelligent, theory-heavy poetry that my friends in the poetry section at my master's program were doing. But it just felt like it felt at first like an accurate way to portray this narrator's voice, and then I really enjoyed the things I was able to do with language through line breaks and through prosody and that kind of thing with her sections. And yeah, it was just a way again to sort of emphasize how different the sisters are, which, I wanted them, because they're twins, but I wanted them to have really distinct personalities. And so hopefully that is reflected on the page even further through the different ways they speak.
Yeah, oh, for sure. I definitely think so. It was really interesting being able to kind of, it felt like I could like hear her in my head really clearly as I was reading the verses especially. And so I thought that was a really great way of approaching those two characters. So let me see. Sorry, I got myself a little bit jumbled because I wanted to like follow the train, and now I'm like, no, wait, the train's off the tracks. Oh, okay. So this book has a lot of very strong queer representation in like a lot of different ways. And so I was wondering what about the story of Snow White and Rose Red felt like it lent itself to telling queer stories?
Yeah. Well, I think part of that is that, the lover, as the bear calls himself in the source tale, comes to the girls in a different body than he ends up as a handsome prince at the end of the story. And, he's a bear, and then he turns into a person. And one of the books that I read in that fairytales and gender class that I mentioned, Kissing the Witch by Emma Donoghue, has slightly spoil it, so apologies, but it's been out for, 20 years now, so it's okay. There's a Beauty and the Beast retelling in which the heroine thinks that the beast assumes that the beast is a man, and then when she transforms at the end is a woman. And so I loved that story. And I was thinking about how, like, what it feels like to be in a body that might not match what how you think of yourself, and so I felt like this story lended itself to just the story of a princess who is cursed to be in the body of a male bear. And obviously, being a bear is its own thing instead of being a human being. But on a kind of, and also the girl who falls in love with her before she sees what she looks like. And I thought that was really beautiful and evocative. And just the fact that we have two heroines in this story, I think, it's unusual among fairy tales that it has two heroines and two girls who get a happy ending instead of just one. And so I thought it was a story that had a lot of space for different kinds of representation. And so we have the two girls who have very different romantic relationships. And there's, so I just felt that there was a lot of space to do different things in this story.
Awesome. So I'd love to talk about the cover of this book. So I know that for the Forest Queen, you kind of had to have like a big switch kind of like right before publication. So I'm curious if you had a similar experience with this cover, or if there was anything interesting about the process of the cover design, because it's really beautiful. I really love looking at the cover.
Yes, I love the cover of this book, and right, it looks so simple, but it's so evocative of so many of the themes that I tried to get across. I love the design of it. I love the colors. I was really thrilled with it. It is the only cover that I saw anyway of the book. So it's like it's always one of my favorite parts of the publishing process is getting to see the cover, because you imagine it so much and what it might look like. But you kind of just get an email one day that says this is the cover. But I've been extremely lucky so far that I've really liked all the covers of my books. I think Clarion, my publisher, has great taste in covers. Yeah, there it is. So so that's great. And this one, it looks a bit more sort of adult to me than my other covers, like a bit more, maybe has a little more gravitas or something, which I think is cool. That makes me happy. And I'm just looking at it right now. So but yeah, I didn't see any other versions of this cover, and I was actually kind of surprised. I always pictured the cover as having the two girls, Ivory and Rosie, on it, but I really liked that they focused on the bear, because when I thought about it, the bear was really the center of the story for me in a lot of ways. And I always love to see how a cover designer can see things in a story that you might not have emphasized yourself. I think people in publishing often say that the author is too close to the story to be able to come up with a good cover for it, and that can be painful for authors to hear, but I think it's true. That someone else can kind of see better than you can, what it is that really stands out visually about your work. And like, it's such a compliment too, just to see someone do such skillful work out of what you've written. I always find it amazing,
For sure. Yeah, and I remembered like looking at it's one of those covers where just those colors are so, like, the colors on it are just so inviting and warm, and I feel like they kind of like draw you to it in a really lovely way. So I feel like it's a really dope cover.
Yeah, I like it.
So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the representation of queerness throughout the book. So Ivory experiences the shift as she kind of discovers her bisexuality with her falling in love with the character of Tam. And as a queer writer yourself, what do you think is the important thing that should be emphasized when you're telling a queer story? Like, what are the kind of stories that you want to see?
I mean, I would struggle to say this is the kind of queer story that should be told, because I don't feel like I would have the authority to say that. But that being said, like, I think I identify as bisexual myself, and but the first people I dated were cis men, and I think it took me a while to kind of accept my bisexuality, like it does for a lot of people, even though I really knew that about myself in early adolescence. It just took me a while to accept it, and so I think it felt very realistic to me to write this character who thinks of herself as only attracted to men until she meets this non-binary person who just kind of blows her away. And what I liked about telling that story is that it's not a huge deal to her. Like, she's surprised by it, but in this world, it doesn't have to be this process of huge suffering. And so she's able to just kind of take that in about herself, and that the two sisters have always known that one of them was attracted to men and one of them was attracted to women. And of course, it turns out to be a little more complicated for at least one of them. And, as a bisexual person, I think I will often still feel like I'm kind of on a journey of figuring myself out. And I think everyone is. Like, I don't at all intend to say that anything is a phase or anything like that at all. But I think, as I go through my life, I'm still learning different things about my sexuality, my gender expression. Over the course of writing this book, I was thinking about myself as a queer person. I actually started using they pronouns as well as she pronouns during the course of writing this book. And I still don't entirely know what more to say about that, but I like that my creative process helps me find out new things about myself. And if my books can do that for my readers as well, then that would make me really happy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of times it's so fascinating the way you can discover things about yourself, like not only do you discover things about the characters, about the world that you're building, but you kind of look at your own writing and think like, oh, that's new. Like,
yeah,
discover something a little more.
Like I can go back and look at my books and my characters will tell me things that I need to remember. Like, oh yeah, you know, like my characters might be smarter than I am about a lot of things. So yeah.
Sure. And I think a lot of times writing also gives you, like, when you look back at things that you've written before, it's almost kind of like, it kind of almost feels like looking at like a yearbook.
Yes,
kind of like looking at like, ooh, so this moment in time when I wrote this thing, this was where I was at.
Well, and it's funny too, like, you know, to be completely transparent, even doing book launch events is a little bit like that, because I wrote this book in summer of 2018, you know, and I've written another book since then that is hopefully coming out in a year or two. And so like I go back and reread my book before it launches so that I can like remember everything I said. But you know, I used to say it's like being asked about your final exams from last year. You know, you have to go back to what you were doing. But that's really cool too, because like I've been keeping a journal since I was 12, 13 years old. And I really love going back and seeing what my past self was up to. And it's really lovely. I think any kind of art you create is like that. It's like a little time capsule and you can see what you were thinking about and struggling with and happy about at the time. And that's, like I said, I wrote this book at a really difficult time in my life, but I was really heartbroken and freaking out about a lot of things. But I hope that there's a kind, like looking back at it now, I can see a kind of rawness and vibrancy in the writing that I'm actually really proud of. Like I was worried about it when I was writing it and I thought it was not polished enough and so on. But that's something that, you know, now that I have a little distance from it, I'm proud of, that I was able to put that on the page.
For sure. So I wanted to talk about kind of the bigger picture things that kind of are happening within this book. You have characters that are genderqueer, characters that are like the bear, not in the body that they know that they should be in. There's a religious group that is intent on squashing down anything that's remotely interesting, that doesn't fit within their like perfect society. And these are like really big, huge societal concepts. And I love that YA has been able to kind of expand itself out and has been able to address these bigger, scarier, harder questions. And so I wonder about your approach to addressing those kind of things. Like, what was kind of your thought process as you were building out this story and knowing that you were going to be kind of bringing in some pretty difficult to talk about topics?
Sure. Well, I think, you know, I've been asked that about sort of writing queer stories in general or putting a feminist lens on classic stories. And I think for me, it's all part of my worldview in general. Like I talk to my students about politics and art, and I think it's impossible not to make your art political in some way. Like even saying this piece of art is not political kind of is a political statement, you know? And so like, I think of myself as a feminist, and, you know, I identify as queer, all these different things. Those things inform my worldview. And of course they inform my writing. It's impossible for them not to. So, and actually, you know, like the Circus Rose has, as you know, has more queer content in it than any of my other books. But actually, like someone else had to say that to me. They're like, oh, this book is way more queer than your other books. And I was like, is it? Because like,
what?
Like, I've been here, you know, it's like, you know, I've written all of them and I've been equally queer the whole time. But like, you know, so I think it's kind of a lot of those larger issues are just sort of how I think about the world and the vantage point from which I see the world. And I think that's a huge reason why we need more diverse voices in all kinds of publishing and all kinds of art, because there's no way that like I can speak from a perspective that isn't my own. And so like one of the most valuable things about reading to me is getting, you know, to see the vantage points that I don't have, that other people have. So it's great that YA is a space that is increasingly progressive and pulling in more diverse voices. It needs to happen even more for sure. And in terms of sort of the religious organization in the Circus Rose, which has sort of been under the surface in the other 3 books that I've set in this universe. I've lived in Ireland for 7 years now, and Ireland has a big history with the Catholic Church, and the charity houses in the Circus Rose were specifically inspired by the Magdalen Laundries here in Ireland, which were places run by the church to give fallen women a place to live and employment, theoretically. But there's been a lot of news coming to light in the last few decades about, women being worked to death there and unwillingly separated from the children they had out of wedlock, and a lot of really awful things. And so that was something that had been on my mind a lot as I was writing the book. I actually went to a protest vigil with my child for the Tuam Mother and Baby Home, which you can Google if you want to. It's a very sad story about one of these Magdalen Laundries. And so I was just, this fairy tale, like I said, is a lot about imagery and the Snow White and Rose Red and the fairy tale colors of black, white, and red. And, I was thinking about how some religious extremism can be so black and white. And so I wanted the church in this book to sort of represent light and whiteness, but in kind of an evil way, like in a sort of stark, unforgiving way in which nothing was allowed to have shades of gray or shadows to it. And so the circus is kind of smoke and mirrors and shadows, but in a kind of warm, loving, welcoming way. And so that was one way that I tried to kind of flip the whole fairy tale conception of lightness and darkness on its head. So hopefully that happened a little bit.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I remember thinking when I was kind of reading the descriptions of the way those spaces were, like with the churches, I was just like, oh, that does seem way more scary. Like everything being like so white and pristine and like no option for anything beyond that starkness.
Yes.
So, yeah. It was so fascinating. So we're almost at the end of my question. So my last question to you directly is, are there any particular queer writers or stories or anything that you might be excited about or want to share?
So the one book that I always recommend in my writing class is actually a book about writing called Writing the Other by Nisi Shawl and Cynthia Ward. And it's kind of a guidebook for writers who are interested in writing about characters whose identity might not match theirs in different ways. Like if, writing about characters of different class or age or race or ethnicity or sexuality than your own, and how to do that in a sensitive way. It's been really helpful for me to, to sort of think about how I approach writing people who are different from myself. And I really highly recommend it. There's been a lot of great talk on Twitter lately about trans affirming YA, especially in the wake of the comments that J.K. Rowling made recently. There's been a lot of uplifting of Black YA writers recently, which I think is fantastic. So I think there are so many good lists out there of great books to check out. So.
Yes. Alrighty, so we are going to open this up to questions. So please feel free, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Betsy, pop them in the Ask a Question, which in theory is either here or it's somewhere over there, counting on where I am oriented on your computer screen. We will start with this one right here. So Ilana would like to know, you mentioned having kept a journal since the age of 12. Have you ever considered writing a memoir?
I would love to write a memoir. I think I'm 31 now, and someone told me in my early 20s that no one in their 20s should write a memoir, and that kind of really stuck in my head. And so when I turned 30, I was like, oh, maybe I can write a memour now.
I don't know. Greta Thunberg, she kind of wrote a memoir.
Right. Yeah, I think it's nonsense, but I was named out of it as a younger person. But actually, I'm embarking on a big project right now that I have a dream of writing a memoir about. I'm a single parent, and I'm moving with my 3-year-old son into an old knitting school in Connemara here in Ireland, and we're going to live in it, and I'm going to convert it into a childcare inclusive arts residency for other single moms. Because writing this book showed me how incredibly challenging it is to do creative work as a single parent and try to pay the bills and all that stuff while looking after your kids. And so I just had this dream arise of finding a place to provide that space for other single moms. And so I've been looking for a sort of sufficiently weird old building in Ireland that I could make into this kind of space. And so I'm working on that right now. It's called the Old Knitting Factory, and it was built in 1906 as a knitting school to teach rural women how to knit so they could support themselves. It's super cool. I'm really excited about it. And we're moving in July, and I have many dreams of writing a memoir about that. I just need to live a little bit more of it first. So.
Totally fair. And that sounds like a really cool, I mean, I imagine that even just the process of going through that is going to be super fascinating, like to write, just being it, just like the mechanics of going from not running a nonprofit and not working in that kind of organization to hopping into something like that. I can only imagine that is rife with drama.
I hope so. I like to say, any life choice I make that might be a little bit foolish, I like to say it's just providing narrative tension in my life. And so, it'll all work out. But I write sort of personal essays for the magazine I work for, Parabola magazine, which looks at world mythology and religion in a kind of intersectional way. So I have done mini memoirs in that regard. If you want to learn many personal things about my life, you can read my essays from Parabola.
You also host the podcast too, right?
Yes, I do. Yes. And so that's Parabola has been going for 45 years now. It's a really longstanding, amazing magazine. And so the podcast is sharing from our archives. So we'd have, one of the founding writers was the woman who wrote the Mary Poppins books, which is really cool. So I might read essays she's written about spirituality or all these different things. It's a lot of fun. Yeah.
That's awesome. So we have a question from Nina Wishengrad, who is asking, will you be doing any other retreats for women who may not be single or have children at home?
Absolutely. That has been part of my dream all along. So in the knitting factory specifically, half the time the space is going to be used as a kind of Airbnb space, and that will sort of fund the childcare inclusive residencies. So that particular program will be right for single moms who have primary custody of children living with them at the time. But I am, for instance, in August, I'm leading a retreat at Kylemore Abbey here in the west of Ireland on mindful healing writing. And I hope to really sort of make this a business and, be able to offer lots of different kinds of retreats for women and for everyone to be able to come to Ireland and do some writing and look around at the beautiful scenery and I'll find some leprechauns and all the good stuff, So.
Yes. I mean, leprechaun hunting kind of sounds like the dream. I'm just saying.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's a dream.
That's a dream. So Meg would like to know, can you tell us more about the queer relationships in the Circus Rose?
Okay, sure. So there's two sort of main queer relationships. We have our two narrators, Ivory and Rosie, who are both identify as young women. And Ivory falls in love with a non-binary character named Tam. And they have a very sweet, I think, sort of wholesome, I hope, romance throughout the story. And then Rosie, the other narrator, falls in love with the princess who is under a curse to live in the body of a male bear and sort of doesn't regain her own body for much of the story. And I'm trying to not say too much about it without like giving more away than that, I guess. But if you know much about the source fairy tale, you'd sort of know kind of how things are going to end up. But I tried to make the queer relationships both central to the story and kind of not a big deal in that I hope that the queerness is sort of feels like a normal or an integral part of this world rather than something that's sort of been squished into it, because like I said, it's just an inherent part of how I see the world myself.
For sure. All righty, let me see. Hang on one second. All right, some of these questions are like my questions too that I kind of popped in there. So you had kind of mentioned earlier that you had been writing, that you've been able to write during the quarantine. How has writing during the quarantine been for you?
I mean, it's been really hard. Like, I think for the first few weeks, I was really struggling to get anything done. Like, I have a then 2-year-old. He turned 3 in April during quarantine. And, even when I had some time to work, I felt really, on edge and worried about a lot of things like everyone has right now. And that kept me from getting into that sort of creative flow space. I also have 3 other jobs that I've been trying to get done during quarantine as well, and so it definitely hasn't been easy. Like when I was in college, I used to wake up at 5 o'clock every morning to get my writing done for the day, and that seems completely impossible to me now. I mean, now my 3-year-old wakes me up at 5 most mornings, and it's rough, And
sure.
so my sort of what I've been trying to tell myself now is if I get any writing at all done during the day right now, then that is a triumph. I can be proud of that, And thankfully, I finished a draft of my next book in February before this all went down. And like I said, I find editing much easier than drafting. So I haven't really been able to do a first, like there's a book I would like to be doing a first draft of right now that I continually feel guilty about not working on. But what I have the capacity to do right now is edit the other one. And so I think I just sort of do what I can. And I try to one thing that single parenting has taught me is that I know in my soul now that I'm doing my best most of the time, so I can say like at the end of the day, I can say, right, I really have given my all to whatever I've done today. And it is never as much as I hope it will be, but I can still say, I feel proud of the effort that I put in today. So, yeah.
Awesome. Alrighty, so we have another question, and I wanted to know, I asked if Abby Palco would like to hop on the screen. Jackson, can you maybe send an invite to Abby and see if she wants to hop on screen and ask her question? And Abby, if you don't want to be on screen, just comment that you don't want to hop on the screen, and that is 100% okay. I can totally ask it for you. I just thought in case you might want to. We'll give it a second. We'll see if she wants to hop on. While we're waiting just to see if she wants to hop on, another question for me. Who are writers that inspire? Oh, no, there we go. Hi, Abby.
Hello. Wait.
Oh, hi, Abby.
Hi, Betsy.
And look at you. Oh, my goodness. Hello.
So wanted to say hi.
Hi, so good to see you. Abby is one of my first writing teachers ever, which is really, really cool.
That's awesome. Yeah. Hello, Abby.
And we just love all of your books, Betsy.
Thank you so much.
So what did we say? We wanted to say hi.
That's part of why I brought you on.
I love it.
Had and hi in parentheses, and I was like, I want to talk to Betsy. I could bring her on.
I love it.
Yeah. So what question did we come up with? Oh, what's your favorite advice to give to young writers?
Okay. I think my favorite advice to give to young writers is to not worry about doing bad writing, because, everybody's writing is worse than they want it to be. Like I will never be as good a writer as I want to be. And that was the thing that kept me from doing it for a long time. And so I think if you can find something that you enjoy writing, whether that's poems or fantasy or history papers or anything, if it's something that you enjoy doing, then it's good. I think for a young writer, you need to focus on the process rather than the final product. And also that the more you write, the better you'll get. My college students talk about compost writing a lot, which is just writing that, doesn't necessarily amount to anything, but you put it in a big pile and eventually it becomes this fertile soil in which your better writing will grow. So do lots of writing, do the kind of writing that you enjoy, and you'll become a better writer for it. And don't worry about it being bad. I think don't worry about it being bad is the best advice I can give.
For sure. Oh, we got one more. I think we have time for one more question. Thank you so much, Abby. It was so lovely to meet you. Bye. All right, so I think we got time for this last question. A lot of queer books have a tendency to not prioritize the physical aspects of the characters' relationships. They might hold hands or eventually kiss at the end, but I noticed that this wasn't the case in The Circus Rose.
Yeah.
Why did you want to share the passion that Ivory feels, her discovery of her attraction for, and kissing of Tam? That is a dope question, Melissa. Thank you so much for asking.
I love that question. I mean, I like writing kissing. It's really fun. So even when I was sick of writing other stuff, I was like, oh, let's do a love scene. And I think it was important for me with Ivory specifically because she was a character who thought of herself as straight for most of her life. And so for her to feel, I wanted her attraction to Tam to not just be this, oh, it doesn't matter what body you're in, we love each other for our souls, which is a lovely thing. I'm not trying to be down on that at all, but I wanted them to have a really embodied attraction to each other and have real chemistry, and I wanted maybe a reader who thinks of themselves as mostly straight to maybe feel some attraction to this non-binary character. And so, I wanted to have a lot of sensuality in their encounters with each other. And I also agree with you. I think there's not enough queer sensuality in queer stories a lot of the time, and it's really frustrating. So I wanted that to be there. I also wanted The Circus Rose to be a very sensual novel in general, not just in a sexual way, but in a kind of sensory way. I wanted there to be just a lot of like physical pleasure of lots of kinds in the book. And so having there be these kind of, these like extended makeout sessions and things like that, like was part of the kind of ethos of the book for me. But also, yeah, I wanted this character who maybe hadn't experienced a lot of queer attraction before to really lean into that experience.
Yes. So good. Well, thank you so much again, Betsy, for being here. I'm so thankful that I got to have this conversation with you. Once again, this is The Circus Rose. It is coming out on Monday, which is incredibly exciting. And we just are so pumped to be carrying the book. And it is going to be available at all of our locations. So please make sure to use the button below to get your copy, or you can also call our locations and we can put one aside for you and you can come swing by and pick it up. Most of our locations are open and at the very least are open for curbside pickup. So if you don't want to come in and browse, that's totally okay. You can just call ahead, order the book, we will hold it aside and you can come pick it up. We hope to see you here next week at 4 p.m. Central Time. We will be doing our next event as part of our Pride series, which is called Looks and Queer Books, Queer Stories Told Through Visual Art. And it's going to be featuring the author Alex Sanchez, as well as the writing team Ash and Chess. And they will be discussing their books and talking about queer DC characters, modern queer history, and how visual art enhances the reading experience. I am so pumped about it. It's going to be so much fun. And also don't forget to check out our events page on barbarasbookstore.com, where you'll find out about all that information, as well as other events we're hosting, like our newly founded trivia that we're going to be hosting every 2 weeks. That'll be super duper fun. So make sure to check all that stuff out. Betsy, do you want to maybe share your socials or how people can follow you before we log off?
Absolutely. So you can find me on Instagram at Betsy Cornwell and on Twitter at Betsy_Cornwell. So, I think if you search for my name in either of those places, you'll find me. I've also just created social media accounts for the Old Knitting Factory for the Arts Residency Project. So you can find us at Old Knitting Factory for any of those. And I'd be happy to send a signed book plate to anyone who purchases the book from Barbara's Bookstore after this event. So if you just send me a DM with a screenshot of your receipt, I'd be happy to mail you a signed book plate. Be delighted to do that. So get in touch. I am around on the internet.
Awesome. Thank you so much again, Betsy. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was really great. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. See you all next week.